I'm also going to share my screen here. Um, let's see. Mm, Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. The physiology of anger.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Um, Thank you, Etchen, for that more than amazing introduction. I'm not worthy of those words, but I appreciate you having me here to share just a few thoughts about anger. This is a topic that I guess is I've been interested in because it's something that I've struggled with over the years. And so, during seminary, I got some time to write about it and read about it. And so I'm just going to share a few thoughts, hopefully, that are helpful to you all because they've been helpful to me over the years. So I titled this The Physiology of Anger. And as Achin mentioned earlier, so this is kind of a part two. The part one was kind of a general introduction to the passions about like what they are. And then in particular, we said a few words about the passion of anger. So, when we talk about the passions, these are the main ones that come to mind, although they're not limited to these: pride, anger, lust, envy, gluttony, greed, and sloth. And so we pretty much talked last time about um, just anger in particular, about, in theory, what anger is in the soul. And today we're gonna recap a little bit of that and then also get into how anger operates within the body, and then the fact of these are two elements of the human person that are very related. The body and the soul are one. Um, and so just to recap a little bit, of course, we have to start in the book of Genesis to understand where we come from and understand the foundations of our faith. Um, we began last time with this question of how can these passions exist? Things like lust and anger and envy, things that are very negative and cause very damaging effects in the world, if everything that God in the world made is good, right? And so we begin from this foundation that God made the world and everything in it, and everything that God made was good. And so um, we want to talk about, so where does passions come from? How have these evil things entered into the world, right? And also fundamentally something that we accept from creation is the fact that the human person is both body and soul. And so let's take a quick recap about some of the things we covered last time, plus a few new things. Everything that God created had a special order and a special intention to it before what we refer to as the fall. So in God's wisdom and in his goodness and the way that he created the world, he brought order out of chaos. And there was this perfect ordering is that the material creation was subject to the body was subject to the soul, and the body and the soul together and all of creation together was turned towards God. Okay. And then, as you can imagine, what you might guess what the next picture is, that after the fall, oh, actually, sorry, one more thing I forgot to mention. It has to do with the qualities of perception, the way that we perceive the world, right? Um, and right now, what we're all used to is that our primary mode of perception of the world is through our five senses, right? We perceive the world through the things that we see, what we can touch, what we can hear, right? But before the fall, another form of perception within the soul was this, what we call the eye of the soul. In some of the spiritual writings, it's referred to as the nous, right? There's this faculty within our soul that we use to see God or perceive God directly. And so when we read in the book of Genesis, we see this almost direct communion, this direct communication between Adam and Eve and God. And then, we'll get to in a second, which is it's that's how things were before the fall, that God and that Adam and Eve were able to have this direct communication with God because the eye of the soul was the reigning perceptive faculty, right? But then after the fall, the we lost this directionality towards God. And then what you see is kind of a reversing of this perfect order that existed. So whereas before, everything was kind of looking upward toward God, we see this reversal of direction, reversal of perception, right? Where the soul then becomes subject to the body, and then the body and soul together, the human person looks towards the material creation, right? That's all we can see, right? And then, we see that this turning towards material creation, back in the ancient civilizations, that, worship of idols, worship of the sun, worship of, inanimate things, and even today, things that we struggle with as far as worship of, we may not see it as worship, but this obsession with material creation still exists today, right? And the other thing where you see the disorder is in the switching of the reigning faculty. So whereas before, this perception of God was the reigning faculty, and now we see that our five senses is now the reigning faculty, something that we're very familiar with. And when it comes to thinking about, the eye of the soul that perceives God, this becomes more mysterious, right? This is harder to talk about. It's harder to understand. And we can only kind of glean information about this through the writings of the saints who have made much progress in really that type of perception. And then finally, a recap of last time is, if we now look within the soul, the way that the fathers understood that there were different faculties in the soul, just like we might understand different faculties of our body, for example, let's say like different systems within the body. And that before, the reigning faculty in the soul was reason, and then anger and desire were subjected to it. And now we would say that now there's an inclination towards this reversal, where it's now very difficult to keep reason as the reigning faculty. And we can all understand that, for example, in the way that desire, like our desire is in and of itself, a good thing, but then it depends on where we direct that desire. Like if we use our reason to keep our desire towards things that are good, then this has positive outcomes, versus if desire can lead us down negative paths as well. And so that was kind of a recap of some of the things that we talked about in the first talk. So we're going to take it from there. We're going to start off with this quote by Saint Isaac the Syrian. If therefore virtue is the natural health of the soul, then the passions are an illness of the soul, which befalls and invades her nature and despoils her proper health. Sorry, I'm going to set a timer here so I know how long I take. Okay, so St. Isaac here brings in the concept of health when talking about the passions, okay? And I find this to be a very useful way to talk about the passions, right? Because the passions are not just about sins in terms of the violating of rules, right? The passions have to do with the very health of our soul, right? So this is a useful metaphor because what we are mostly accustomed to and have a better understanding of is the health of our bodies. We've been studying this for many centuries. Medical advancements have come quite a long way in how we take care of bodily illnesses. And so we can use this metaphor to better understand how the passions operate in the soul. So we might say that in the body, when everything is going well and all the systems of the body are operating as they should, the nervous system, the circulatory system, then we could say that there's perfect order within the body, and we would call that we would say that there's perfect health within the body. But then when these same systems that are, for the functioning and benefit of our body start to go awry, when they don't work as they should, then we call this illness or sickness within the body. Okay, so this is the metaphor that we're going to carry forward here with. Okay, so we talked about in the last talk about the theory of how anger should operate within the soul. But let's switch gears here and talk about how anger operates within the body. So take a moment and think about the last time you were really, really angry. Something really upset you. You were really mad at someone or something or some incident in life. Okay, and then just take a moment and reflect on what you felt within your body. What were the symptoms that you were having within your body? You might remember things like your face feeling hot. You might remember things like breathing heavily or quicker than usual. Maybe you've been so angry that you've been shaking, like visibly shaking, like your muscles are shaking or tense. And then other things that were happening within your body that you may or may not have realized is that maybe your mouth felt dry or that your pupils were dilated. Okay, so there's actually a number of things that happen physiologically within the body when you get mad. Okay, and they're listed out in this slide. Dilation of the pupil's eye. So I mentioned most of these: fast breathing, your heart rate increases, muscles tense. Now, there's also a number of things that happen in the body. Certain hormones are released, like adrenaline, cortisol in the bloodstream. Now, this might be starting to sound familiar to you if you have studied in the medical background, or if you think way, way back to biology classes from high school or elementary school. These seem like random symptoms, but in fact, these things within the body are something called it's controlled by the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And that is a fancy way of saying the fight or flight response within the body. So this is an automatic response within the body. And now, like, what is the purpose? Because, you know, those symptoms that I mentioned in the previous slide, they seem kind of arbitrary, but if you think about what they're actually doing for the body, so dilation of the pupils allows maximum light to enter into the eyes for maximum visual acuity. The increased heart rate and the faster breathing. So this is to pump blood to the extremities, right? So to the arms and to the legs. The tensing of the muscles, the release of extra energy through adrenaline. All these things are for the purpose of your body being to act quickly in a circumstance of increased stress or danger, right? So that's what all these different things that, you know, so we just experience them, you know, as kind of random things within the body, but that is what the purpose is. It's for you to be able to act quickly in a situation of distress or danger. Now, the interesting thing is that the fathers of the church had a very similar understanding of anger even several centuries ago, right? So this is a quote from St. Basil the Great. And this is him talking about how anger operates within the soul. For the temper is a sinew of the soul. So the word sinew means like tendon or ligament. So he's basically making a bold claim here that it's so fundamental that it's like part of the soul. That temper is a sinew of the soul, producing vigor in it for the accomplishment of good actions. So you see this amazing parallel that how anger operates within the body is also how anger operates within the soul. And of course, this is true because, you know, the body and the soul are intertwined mysteriously. They are one, right? And so, and we only see the separation of this as the aftermath of the fall, which we call death, when the body and the soul separate. But as part of its intention, we see that there's this dual or mirror functionality of anger, both within the body and the soul, working in tandem. So, you know, so now you can see, you know, the fight or flight response in the body. Obviously, its intention for the body is to keep the body safe, right, in times of danger or stress. But then, of course, you know, it really depends on how we use the fight or flight response, right? And unfortunately, all too often, when we see the negative effects of anger from the fight or flight response, we see that perhaps maybe we don't flee often enough, or perhaps we choose to fight the wrong people or the wrong things. And then you have, you know, a system within the body that's intended for self-preservation or survival that is then, you know, used, I guess, improperly, and it can lead to, you know, the damaging of relationships, the damaging of friendships, you know, and cause serious harm to the body or for others, right? And if, you know, anger is, you know, the response of anger is there constantly in the body for you know, for years, and this becomes a mode of operation. There's also studies that look at how anger or chronic anger affects the body, and it's been linked to things like increased risk of premature cardiovascular disease, increased stress-related health problems like panic attacks and things like that, and also the increased risk for substance abuse as well, right? Okay, so now we're going to move on to this, you know, to understand it, take it even one step further, right? So actually before that, you know, before anger becomes implanted within our soul as a deep-seated passion, it really begins, you know, these chronic issues, whether it's within, you know, talking about our body or the soul, it doesn't happen overnight, right? It's something that happens over time, right? Especially if we don't do anything to to stop it or to change course. Um, and oftentimes, just like with bodily illnesses, by the time we're seeing severe signs and symptoms of it, it means a number of other things have already happened. So, we get a fever or a runny nose or something like congestion, those are signs and symptoms that something's wrong in the body and that we're sick. But a number of things have already happened within the body, to get us to that point. There's been some kind of virus or bacteria that's invaded the body, infected maybe some system within the body, and then a number of things happen afterwards, and then we don't realize we're sick until after, right? So one of the things that we're going to talk about next is how anger actually manifests, or what is the mechanism of action of anger within the body. And so we're going to turn to some elements of psychology here. And one of the sources I used here is Dr. Ryan Martin. He's been studying anger for over 20 years. So he's devoted his entire life to really studying this. And he's done a number of studies and written books about it. And one of the things that he came up with is this diagramming of how anger happens, right? And so some of the things as you hear them, they're gonna sound maybe even kind of obvious, right? But it's interesting that sometimes just seeing it, kind of written out or explained, it kind of helps us recognize it in the future, and Father Sergius, who's the abbot of our monastery, gave us this great advice in our class once, and he said, you name it to tame it regarding the passions. Like, you have to be able to be aware of how the passions are operating, or if they're even operating at all in your life, in order to be able to take control of it or to tame it, right? And so that's kind of the purpose of the next set of slides, is to actually look at how anger operates. So, okay, so we're going to start with the precipitant. So this is what Dr. Ryan says. Often people describe as, quote unquote, the thing that made them angry. Okay, so that's if someone's angry and you ask them, why are you mad? This will be the thing that they name usually, right? So what makes people angry? So obviously a number of different things, but over the course of his research, he kind of boiled it down to three main things, and they kind of overlap a little bit, but it kind of boils it down, makes it easier to digest. What are the things that make people angry, right? So first of all, one of the things he came up with was injustice, right? And so obviously this one's kind of self-explanatory, and over the last couple of years, we've seen these huge, I guess, issues, social issues, political issues, and then these different things that lead to protesting and riots. People get really heated up about things that they consider injustices in the world, right? So this is one category. Another category is poor treatment. Okay, so this again is anytime someone feels like they've been treated poorly, right? And whether it's and here's the perception is more important than anything. Whether or not they're actually in reality being poorly treated doesn't matter as much. It's more so, do they perceive that we're being poorly treated, right? So this might be things like, for waiting in line for too long, if someone cuts us off the road in traffic, if someone is late to hanging out, doesn't return a call, things like that. If we feel like we're being poorly treated, this might be one of the things that we list as a precipitant of anger, okay? And then thirdly, when our goals are blocked, right? So this might be like, if we can't find our keys and we're trying to get to work, right? Or something's getting in the way, or if we get stuck at like a red light when we're in a hurry, those kinds of things. So if something is getting in our way, this is another thing that people state as a precipitant. Okay, so these are like the top three things. Some of these overlap, but they're also distinct in certain ways, right? So if you take hypothetically, like a soccer game, for example. So if a ref makes a bad call, right, someone might consider that an injustice, right? But if a player gets tripped, right, and that might be considered poor treatment. And then if a goal gets blocked, that's literally maybe a goal block, right? So they're somewhat distinct, but of course there can be overlap with these, okay? Okay, so the precipitant is the thing that people state makes them angry, but that's not the only factor, right? There's an element called the pre-anger state, okay? So the pre-anger state has to do with what is the state of your body when you experience this precipitant, right? So there could be elements like An obvious one is you're hungry, right? People call it being hangry. That's a thing. Or if you're sleepy, sleep deprived, if you're stressed out about some even unrelated thing, right? If you're too hot or too cold, oftentimes the pre-anger state is exacerbated by being uncomfortable in some kind of way. Okay, so things that kind of put you on edge already, right? So it's the combination. We can also mention here, this is not exactly pre-anger state, but also the fact that anger doesn't happen in a vacuum usually. Usually that anger is accompanied, sometimes it's called a secondary emotion because there's something else also happening and then anger is kind of mixed along with it, right? So it could be a number of things that perhaps you're scared, you're insecure about something, you're sad about something, jealous, not in control, stressed out, guilty. Um, so just I thought I would add this slide as well, something to be mindful of. Okay. Um, okay, so moving on. So the precipitant is the thing that made you angry, right? The tipping point. And then along with the pre-anger state, so whatever mode that your body is in, whether you're sleepy, hungry, too hot, too cold, whatever it is, those two together now enter into this appraisal process. So now we're in this second box right next to the first two. Okay, so what is the appraisal? So the appraisal is it's your brain making sense of the information and deciding whether or not it's going to get angry about something, right? So you can have the same exact precipitant and maybe even the same pre-anger state, but you might appraise it differently depending on the situation. So hypothetically, let's just talk about like a sports analogy. Like a ref makes a bad call, right? Now, depending on the situation, you may or may not get angry about that, right? If it's like a preseason game, so very low stakes, not much to lose, and a ref makes a bad call, it might be irritating, it might be annoying, but it may not push you over the top and make you angry about something. But if you can imagine that it's like the championship game, right? And then there's other factors that go into appraisal, like is the action on purpose? So let's just say it's the championship game and you were tripped by another player in soccer, for example. Now, your decision on whether or not that tripping was done purposefully or by accident is going to play into the appraisal process. Also, whether you're a victim or not. If you're a victim, oftentimes, in these studies that were done, you're more likely to appraise it and the result being anger, right? That comes out of it. So the appraisal process is your body kind of calculating all these things and deciding, depending on the circumstance, whether or not it goes to the next step, which is developing angry feelings, right? So like I said, usually if the stakes are higher, if whatever the precipitant is done on purpose, and if you're a victim, these are some examples of things that might lead to a worse outcome as far as the appraisal. And the appraisal happens kind of subconsciously. It's not like it's kind of a quick process. It's kind of like your brain subconsciously making this decision. Um, and then you have this, and then so then if in fact like all these factors come together, then the next thing that happens, this is when the angry feelings come in, right? And feelings, of course, are not just being mad. Like sometimes if you ask a child, what are you feeling? I'm mad, or I'm just mad, and that's all that they can say. And depends, depending on how used to we are about talking about our feelings, maybe for many years, maybe into our teens, we can't really articulate um, what we're feeling exactly, right? We just generally feel like we're mad. So emotions, there's a lot to be said about this. I put up this slide just to show you the diversity of different things that we can feel. Everything from just being annoyed or bitter all the way up to feeling aggressive or irritated, right? So this is again to bring up the concept of self-awareness once again, to be aware. What are we actually feeling? Like how severe is it? Can we articulate properly what we're feeling exactly? Or is it just like a big blob of emotion, right? Okay, so and then at that point, we carry these angry feelings, and then the very next step after that, obviously, is what these expressions of anger are. This is kind of like the end of the road where we go from those angry feelings into things that are more outwardly expressive. We might make faces, we might, or worse, we might like lash out verbally, physically, it can be, and this is where, it gets the most dangerous, right? We might say something hurtful that we can't take back, send an angry text, throw something, punch a wall, whatever it is, right? So then there's all these physical and behavioral things that come after that. So there's this whole pathway of things that take us from just, one instigating factor to potentially like a violent response, right? And so again, I think a lot of these things, I don't think you were necessarily surprised, wouldn't be surprised by this. At least my experience when I was reading this is I wasn't necessarily surprised by these things, but it was very, very helpful for me personally to just see the pathway, to read about it, for me to be able to, well, we'll talk about how to use this in a moment, so I don't want to jump the gun, but this is the pathway that I found very, very helpful here. The interesting thing also is that, this pathway at the top is directly from the writings of, the Desert Fathers, right? And so from, again, many, many centuries ago, I don't have time to get in too much into detail about these different things, but there's also a strong overlap about how they write about going from thought all the way to the actual sin being carried out. There's an amazing parallel, just like I was talking about with the body and the soul. There was amazing parallel here as well. A lot of these mean roughly the same things. Okay. So what do we do? How do we use this practically? Okay. So wrapping up here shortly. First, a word of encouragement. I always start with a word of encouragement because this is not easy stuff. This is hard. Like, even though, like I said, we hear it, I can read this, but even though I've read this and written about it, I still fail at it all the time, right? So it doesn't mean that just because we understand this up here, that we're just ready to immediately apply this. So word of encouragement first. Do not fall into despair. This is by Saint Ignatius. He's a monk writing this. Do not fall into despair. By your firmness in the struggle, show the tenacity of your purpose and the stability of your free will. When thrown down, get up. When duped and disarmed, rearm yourself afresh. When defeated, again, rush to the fight. It is extremely good to see within yourself both your own fall and the fall of the whole of humankind. So there is some positive element to struggling with the passions. It never feels good to struggle, but there are spiritual benefits that come from it, right? It humbles us. We see our own weaknesses. We also are able to sympathize better maybe with other people who might struggle with a similar thing, right? And then he continues and says, it is essential for you to recognize and study this fall in your own experience, in your heart and mind. It is essential for you to see the infirmity of your knowledge and intellect and the weakness of your will. So I'm just going to highlight this recognize and study part. This is absolutely fundamental to the spiritual life. We have to recognize and study within ourselves the passions when they manifest, all right? The very, very first step and kind of the purpose of the talk really is to be self-aware of how anger manifests within our lives when it does, right? So, we talked about that every passion has a corresponding virtue. And so patience is the one that combats anger, but patience is not, it's not a passive process, right? Patience takes work. So what this means might be, so this is just some practical advice that has helped me in the past, and even currently. So at the end of the day, be still and reflect, okay? So reflect on the events of the day. Was there a fight that happened? Did we get angry about something, even if we didn't say anything or do anything? Maybe it just remained as a thought within our head that kind of swam in our head for a couple hours or so. Did we get angry, right? So then if we did get angry, right, map what happened, right? So mentally just talking out or even writing down, what was the precipitant? What was the thing that we thought made us angry? And what state were we in when that happened? So trying to recognize maybe there's a pattern. Maybe we realize like every single time we're stressed out about this thing and we're sleepy, then this anger response happens. We might see a pattern over time. Then we might reflect and ask, how could we approach it differently next time if the same instance were to happen again? And then to hopefully reconcile with the person, if it was with another person, to repent, and of course, as always, to lean on God for strength. As St. Paul says, do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. It's really important not to let these feelings dwell within us for a really long time, like not just for the chronic issues that can happen, but then also for the damage it can do to our soul. You know, we understand that the longer the passions stay around, the harder they are to get rid of. And so hopefully at the end of every day, if we could reconcile with those who we've been angry with, this would be a very good thing. So this is my last slide. I just wanted to share these thoughts with you. Achin, thank you so much for the opportunity to share.